Hello, welcome back. I wanted to thank you for the kind responses on my first roleplay. Today I'm going to continue reading from my book, Sparrowmancer. I'm going to be reading from Chapter 3. I read Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 in separate videos, and I will post links to those videos. Chapter 3 is a longer chapter, so I'm only going to be reading part of it today, and I'll read the rest next time. Okay, let's get started. Sparrow rode through several nights of violent storms. Rain scourged the ground. Wind ripped small trees from the mud. Thunder roared the fury of the sky. Signs of the Naveb appeared on a far drumlin, blue and white banners flying from a firelit outpost. Sparrow hoped the rain would hide him, and he ran dark past the outpost without even his headlamp on. If anyone saw him, he gave no sign. Should he go to them, turn himself in? Should he face the consequences of what he'd done? He hadn't done anything. He tried to feel guilty of something, but he couldn't. He felt sorrow for the dead, but whomever had pulled that grenade's pin had done it himself. Sparrow hated that the Naveb were his enemies. He wanted to know them, but it was clear that there'd been no hope of that from the start. It was another misfortune behind him, another tragedy in the world, more that he couldn't take back. But the world remained, and the world continued. He would continue too. Sparrow camped in gone ruins as they became more common. Soon he entered a denuded area dominated by sagging buildings of steel and glass. He was near the burning graves now, the Naveb's dead city. There was still some intact concrete here. His hoverbike glided easily over it, having been made, after all, for a paved flat world. Sparrow sheltered in a gone bookstore. It still had a working door, and its roof was where it should be. He pulled his hoverbike right through the entrance and parked it in the new releases section. Then he walked the stacks, pulling a book down now and again to flip through it. There were no books on magic, but there were some that described apocalyptic scenarios. Some contained unusual monsters, and some contained monstrous humans. How well entertained the gone people had been. Sparrow put a few hardbacks into his saddlebags. He preferred biographies. The true stories of real gone fascinated him. All the most important events of their lives were meaningless now. All their predictions for the future had been wrong at the last. Their world and its glory had ended, and this one had begun. What would happen when this one was over? What would this one become? It occurred to Sparrow that endings could be illusions. He went to sleep thinking about how much he mattered in the grand scheme of things. When he dreamed, he saw the green eye of the Lolo, but it had no power anymore. Now it was caged, tortured. Gone is the gone world. Gone is the young Naveb with improbable harlequin green eyes. In the morning, Sparrow felt stuck to his rubber blanket. His neck ached, and there was a sharp pain behind his eyes. The harrowing was upon him, swollen fat, trying to crush him back to sleep. He stood anyway, focused on getting dressed and packing his things to move on, and thought about Ethel, saying that he was one of them. Buoyed, he set out into the broken cityscape. The rain finally let up. All day it dried in the streets, dripped from cracking gutters, shone the reflections of streetlights that still functioned. These were few. The dead city grew up wet around Sparrow, and there was still some life in it after all. Some things still moved, mechanical things with damaged minds still alive inside them. The gone people had built false brains, but it had no magic. They had been apart from the world. Now their creations were all lost. Most were dead, insofar as death could apply to artificial life, and the rest were haunted. What had happened to the gone world? There was nothing in their books about that, at least not that Sparrow had ever seen. As far as he knew, gone history stopped all at once at the singularity of their destruction. He'd heard that the collapse was a magical catastrophe, and he had heard it was a military one. He had no opinion of his own. The twisted ruins the gone had left behind whispered nothing about what had come before. They only bore the scars. Sparrow walked his hoverbike through the rubble-strewn streets. Cars sat empty, and there was something sad about them. Many had been stripped to their frames. Others had been used as homes. Seats lay all the way back. Sleeping bags in the floorboards with empty food wrappers scattered over them. A few still had functioning kinematic field rings. Sparrow searched these for parts and stuffed his saddlebags. He picked through stores, finding the occasional tool or packaged food item. He took a first aid kit and a few power cells for his hoverbike. Some buildings still had electricity. In these, he was invariably compelled to stare up at the lights until his eyes hurt. It amazed him how much technology could seem like magic. What was the cost of mechanical automation? Were machines harrowed? Sometimes he found money on the street. He had nothing to do with the coins and bills, but he knew such things had been of great importance in the gone world. Now one got what one took, one way or the other, or one traded. There was a brutality to the new world. One was encouraged to cut throats. Edel's people traded smooth stones. What did the Naveb trade, if anything? Sparrow imagined that acquisition of wealth had been a more dignified affair in the gone times. Gone money seemed to be everywhere. The day wore on. Sparrow pushed through the outskirts of the dead city, walking corridors of ruin between the few skyscrapers in this district, picking up whatever he could find. Just after midday, he came upon a pile of corpses. Most were skeletal, and many were wearing blue Naveb jewelry. He looked at the pile for a long time, trying to feel broken-hearted. The dead carried weight, he knew that. They meant something. But he didn't feel it through the oppressive magic sadness of the harrowing. They were nothing, gone like everything here. Their world had ended far from Aurori, but his continued. child's voice rang out. Strong cries for help echoed down the hallways of ruin. Sparrow mounted his bike and sped off toward the source of the sound. His pulse began to race. Anxiety beat in his head like a bat in a jar. He wanted to turn around, and he almost did, but instead he kept his hand on the accelerator. It was simple to do nothing about the fear, the cold, intellectual matter. He pressed on, speeding over double yellow lines, dodging debris in vehicles. As he drew near, the shouting stopped, shut off, like a light, like a device. Then he saw the source of the child's cries. A huge machine stood in a roundabout. Its heavy, canted chassis was poised over 4 thick legs, each of which ended in heavy treads. It had a cockpit, but there was no one inside it. It moved on its own, acting on unknowable impulses, bursting across its malfunctioning digital mind. It detected Sparrow, and Sparrow drifted hard to a stop and rolled off his hoverbike to dodge its incoming salvo. The machine pelted the smashed buildings behind Sparrow with hot particle fire. Dust and debris blew up in huge billows, and Sparrow pulled his goggles down over his eyes. "Help!" cried a child's voice from the machine's speaker. "Can anybody hear me?" Sparrow got to his feet. He pulled the hoverbike down to his hip and extended its combat handles. The CX-580 was a convertible, but he'd rarely had to convert it. Every time he had, it had been in a situation like this. Gone machines had tried to inherit the world, but they couldn't think without their creators. They were all wild, no more dangerous than storms or earthquakes. While they were capable of tremendous devastation, they were incapable of self-direction. Sparrow had faced them before. That was why he had gone to such great lengths to acquire this particular hoverbike. With the combat handles extended, the kinematic field rings recalibrated themselves to compensate for extreme recoil. Sparrow aimed his bike, now a paragun, and pressed the firing switch. Sparrow's paragun barked and shook as it spit Mayon particle fire in short, controlled bursts. The giant machine staggered on its treaded feet, its armor melting at the point of impact, cracks radiating outward. Its acrylic canopy shattered, and its cockpit's interior caught fire. Fire suppression systems kicked on, and the burning cockpit filled with foam. The robot engaged an evasive pattern, backing away from Sparrow. Sparrow let off the firing switch as he advanced. There was a pop of rifle fire. Sparrow looked up to see the glints of scopes in several windows around the roundabout. As snipers rained fire upon the giant machine, Sparrow opened up his paragun again. He focused on its legs as best he could. The machine fired wildly, and then collapsed. Several parts burst inside it, and burning plasma spread over its chassis. Sparrow ducked behind his paragun, pressing his hands to his ears. The loud sounds of the machine's destruction scattered his thoughts and made him angry. He squeezed his eyes closed again and rocked until the noises stopped. When he looked up again, his head aching, the machine was a smoking hulk. Just another wreck like everything else in the city. Sparrow felt a little sad for it. Then he took several deep breaths, converted his paragun again, and walked out into the roundabout with his hoverbike in tow. Sparrow's body was shaking. His arms and back ached from the cannon's recoil. Anxiety thumped in his blood, sat like sickness in his stomach, made him weak all over. He watched his feet, counting his steps. It was what he could do. Focus on mechanical tasks, acknowledge emotion, and then remove it from his consideration. He searched, or rather reached, the destroyed machine as 5 people emerged from the surrounding buildings. They came out into the street, long rifles on their shoulders. One had a cane gun, as the Navep had, but she knew how to hold it. They approached Sparrow with smiles, brightening their dirt-smeared faces. "I haven't seen a CX-580 for a while," said the woman with the cane gun. She was Sparrow's height and missing teeth. Her eyes were ion blue. "That was Uncle. We've been trying to take him down for months. Thanks for the help." Sparrow nodded. "I didn't have much choice," he said. Self-preservation kicked in. "Do you live in these ruins or something?" "Yeah," said a man with a scar on his chin. "Well, just outside, actually. We come in to scrounge and to hunt platforms. What are you doing here? Are you from Seth?" "I don't know what that is. I'm only passing through," Sparrow replied. "What do you hunt machines for?" "For plants," said a sniper that was no more than a boy. He had brown eyes, a red bandana on his shaved head. Sparrow had to force himself not to stare at the boy's hand, which appeared to be a mechanical prosthetic. He'd never seen that before. He'd thought augmented people were a myth. "Power plants are pretty much indestructible," the boy continued. "Look." He slung his rifle over his shoulder, affixed it to a magnetic plate on his upper back, and began to climb Uncle. Sparrow was a good climber, but he envied this boy's grace and speed. Lithe as a rat, he clambered up the machine's eggshell armor, finding handholds as if he had designed the thing himself. He knew his way, and he was strong, a young man at the top of what he was doing. It made Sparrow sad to think about how the world would break him, how everything he'd thrown himself into would either take his life or grind it away to his lasting ennui. That was the inevitable end of enthusiasm. While the boy was climbing, another one of the group approached Sparrow, a tow-headed woman with eyes that were equally pale. "Where are you coming from?" she asked. "I came over the western desert," Sparrow replied. "The one at the end of the world?" She had a look on her face. Was it her normal expression? "Maybe for some," Sparrow said. "It must be that a lot of people die crossing it. But I didn't." "You don't like being poked, do you?" She laughed. Sparrow looked up at the boy climbing Uncle. "Do you?" he asked. The boy surmounted the platform and placed his prosthetic hand flat atop a panel on its upper part. There was a clank and a hiss, and the panel lifted. A hexagonal object of metal and acrylic slid into the boy's waiting hands. He held the power plant up. It had a blue ball of bright light glowing inside it, suspended at its center by crackling strands of energy. Then the boy swung back to the ground and came to give Sparrow a closer look at it. "It's a big one," he said, beaming. "Plats run on this special energy. Can't find it anywhere else. We call it foxfire." Sparrow looked into the power plant. The foxfire ball rotated like a star behind its casing. He touched the plant and was surprised to find it cool. "It's like a cold sun in a box," Sparrow said. "What do you do with them?" "Running plats is all they can do. Nobody trades for them," explained the woman with the cane gun. "We take them because we're building our own platforms." The woman continued smiling, not at all embarrassed about the state of her mouth. She must have been Sparrow's age, but she wasn't ground down yet. Maybe she had a cold sun of her own inside her. Sparrow began to think of these people as machines themselves. Sparrow looked at Uncle. "These are war machines," he said. "Is there a war?" Another of the people stepped forward. His appearance was monstrous. He was huge, and he had no hair on any part of his body that Sparrow could see. His skin was blotchy, almost squamous in some places. "Yeah, there's a war," he said. His voice was mellifluous and warm. It poured from his mouth like a sweet reward. Sparrow noticed that he wore a necklace with a single blue bead for a pendant. And it'd be nice to have another big gun, Endworlder. That's where I'm going to stop for today. Thank you again for listening. And until next time, have a good day.